It began with a silence no one could explain. Sarah Miller had always been the kind of woman who kept in touch, the kind who sent morning texts, weekend photos, and long, heartfelt emails to her mother back home in Bristol. So when days passed without a single word, her family knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah, 29, had recently moved to a small island in Portugal with her boyfriend, Daniel Walsh. It was meant to be a new beginning, a peaceful escape from the noise of their past. The couple had packed up their modest London apartment, sold their furniture, and flown out with 2 suitcases and a promise of fresh starts. They rented a little white cottage near the sea, surrounded by cliffs and wildflowers, where Sarah told her friends she finally felt free. At first, everything seemed perfect. Her emails were full of warmth and excitement, morning walks by the beach, dinners under the stars, the laughter she and Daniel shared as they adjusted to their quiet new life. But slowly, her tone began to shift. She wrote less about happiness and more about exhaustion. The once vivid photographs she sent, sunsets, smiling selfies, homemade meals, grew rare, replaced by vague messages about being busy or not feeling herself lately. Then, nothing. Her last message arrived on a cloudy Friday evening in March. "Mom, don't worry if you don't hear from me for a bit," it read. "I need some space to think." The words felt unlike her. Detached. Distant. Her mother reread them over and over, unease prickling at the back of her neck. 2 weeks later, Daniel returned to England, alone. He told everyone that he and Sarah had broken up. According to him, she'd fallen for another man on the island and left without warning. "She's not the person I thought she was," he said flatly, when her sister, Laura, called to ask what had happened. He sounded calm. Too calm. But what troubled the family most were the emails that came after. They appeared to be from Sarah, sent from her usual account, insisting she was fine and traveling with someone new. The words were robotic, almost scripted. "I'm happy. Please stop asking about me. I just need a clean break." Her mother's heart sank with every sentence. Sarah never wrote like that. Not once in her life. Laura grew convinced something was wrong. She contacted the British Embassy and filed a missing person report. Investigators in Portugal began their search, starting at the small home Sarah and Daniel had shared. Inside, they found traces of an interrupted life, her clothes in the wardrobe, her passport in a drawer, her phone missing. The kitchen table was set for 2. When questioned, Daniel stuck to his story. He claimed Sarah had left one night after an argument, taking only her handbag and a few belongings. "She wanted to disappear," he said. "She told me not to follow her." But when detectives traced the IP address of those strange emails, the results told a different story. They had all been sent from the same Wi-Fi network registered to Daniel Walsh. Detectives knew from the start that something about Daniel Walsh didn't sit right. On the surface, he appeared calm, cooperative, even charming. But beneath that composure, there was something cold, rehearsed. When asked simple questions, he hesitated just long enough to sound unsure. In the small Portuguese town of São Miguel, the investigation began to unfold quietly but persistently. Locals remembered seeing Sarah and Daniel together often during their first months on the island, walking hand in hand through the cobblestone streets, laughing over coffee in the harbor cafe. But as time went on, their behavior changed. The laughter stopped. Neighbors started hearing shouting late at night, muffled through the thin cottage walls. Maria Alves, the woman who lived next door, told police she had once seen Sarah sitting alone on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. When Maria asked if she was all right, Sarah gave a faint smile and said, "Just a rough day." The following week, she vanished. Investigators began piecing together a timeline. Bank records showed that Sarah hadn't withdrawn any money since the day before she disappeared. Her phone, last active that same night, had pinged once near the cliffs south of the village, then went dark forever. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to England, quickly settling back into his life as if nothing had happened. He moved into his brother's flat in Manchester, told friends he was trying to move on, and started applying for new jobs online. But behind the scenes, his story began to crumble. Detectives in Portugal, working with Interpol, examined his digital footprint. They discovered that the emails Sarah had supposedly sent after disappearing were written from the very cottage Wi-Fi Daniel continued to use for 2 weeks after she was last seen. Even the timestamps matched his work schedule, late at night, after he'd returned from the pub. When confronted with this, Daniel grew defensive. "She told me to send them," he insisted. She said she didn't want her family to panic. But Sarah's family refused to believe it. Her mother, Anne, provided dozens of old emails for comparison, messages full of warmth, humor, and Sarah's distinct turns of phrase. The new ones were stripped of emotion, written with perfect grammar and a tone that felt empty. Forensic linguists confirmed what the family already knew in their hearts: the writer was not Sarah Miller. By that point, rumors had spread through the small island community. Locals whispered that Daniel had been drinking heavily in the weeks before she vanished. A bartender from the Blue Cove bar claimed he once saw a bruise on Sarah's arm when she came in alone. Another neighbor mentioned hearing something heavy being dragged across the cottage floor late one night, followed by the sound of Daniel's car starting before dawn. Detective Inspector Miguel Duarte, leading the case, began to suspect the truth: Sarah hadn't run away at all. Working with local volunteers, his team organized searches of nearby beaches, wooded trails, and abandoned wells. They found nothing: no phone, no bag, no body. But one discovery changed everything. Buried in the soil behind the cottage, just a few feet from where Daniel had planted a new flower bed, investigators uncovered a small gold necklace engraved with the initials SM. It was Sarah's, a birthday gift from her sister Laura. When questioned again, Daniel's calm began to fracture. His voice shook. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, staring down at the table in silence. Detective Duarte leaned forward. "Mr. Walsh," he said softly, "we believe you know exactly what happened to Sarah." Daniel looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "You'll never find her," he whispered. Daniel Walsh had always presented himself as a man of quiet charm, polite, articulate, the kind who could talk his way through any situation. But as investigators began to dig deeper, a darker picture began to emerge, one of manipulation, jealousy, and control that had followed him long before the move abroad. In Manchester, police began interviewing people who had known Daniel prior to his life with Sarah. What they uncovered was disturbing. His ex-girlfriend, Claire Matthews, described a pattern of emotional abuse that echoed what Sarah's family suspected. "He could be so sweet at first," Claire said, her voice trembling as she spoke to detectives. "But when things didn't go his way, it was like a switch flipped. He'd turn cold. Blame you for everything. And then he'd start following you, checking your phone, your friends, everything." Claire had left him 5 years earlier after a violent argument that left her terrified. She'd filed a report but later withdrew it, convinced by Daniel's apologies and promises to change. "He was very good at making you doubt yourself," she admitted. "I still don't know why I ever believed him." This new information helped detectives understand what might have happened in Portugal. They began to see Sarah not as a woman who vanished by choice, but as someone trying to escape a man who wouldn't let her go. Back on the island, Portuguese investigators continued their search of the property. They combed through every inch of the small white cottage, lifting floorboards, checking the drains, and searching the coastal cliffs nearby. The walls were freshly painted, the carpets scrubbed. Yet in the bathroom, luminol testing revealed faint traces of blood beneath the tiles. DNA analysis confirmed it was Sarah's. Daniel was arrested the next morning. He maintained his innocence, claiming the blood was from a nosebleed Sarah had suffered days before she disappeared. But his calm demeanor was starting to erode. During questioning, his story changed repeatedly, first saying they'd argued, then insisting she'd left peacefully, then suggesting she might have drowned after storming off toward the sea. Meanwhile, British detectives working the case from home found something else: messages Daniel had sent to another woman, a woman named Natalie Parker. They had been seeing each other in secret for months before he moved abroad. Natalie, unaware of Sarah's existence, told police that Daniel had reached out again just weeks after Sarah went missing. "He said he was back in the country and wanted to see me," she explained. "He told me his girlfriend had left him for someone else." But Natalie wasn't the only one. Further investigation revealed Daniel had been leading a double life: another woman, another lie, and a child he had never mentioned. Sarah had discovered it all shortly before the move. She'd confided in her sister, saying she wanted to confront him and finally be free of all of it. That confrontation may have been what sealed her fate. Detective Duarte pieced together a new theory: Sarah had threatened to leave Daniel once and for all, perhaps even expose his hidden life. That night, a violent argument erupted inside the cottage, one that ended with her death. Still, without a body, prosecutors could not bring a murder charge. They needed something more. 2 weeks later, a break came from an unlikely source: a British tourist named Adam Lewis, who had taken photographs along the island's southern cliffs the same weekend Sarah vanished. When he heard about the case on the news, he went back through his pictures. In the background of one image, barely visible through the fog, was a man carrying a large, dark bag down a rocky path toward the sea. The timestamp placed the photo just after midnight, the night Sarah was last seen alive. When police enhanced the image, the man's face was unmistakable. It was Daniel Walsh. Once the photograph surfaced, everything changed. Detectives had always suspected that Daniel Walsh had done something to hide Sarah's body, but now they finally had a direction: the jagged stretch of coastline south of São Miguel, a remote area known for its caves, sharp cliffs, and unpredictable tides. Locals said that once something, or someone, went into those waters, it rarely came back. The search began at dawn. The Atlantic was restless that morning, waves crashing against the rocks as police divers descended into the gray-green depths. For hours they scoured the seabed, battling strong currents and poor visibility. On the cliffs above, Detective Miguel Duarte watched anxiously, his face drawn and tense. Then, around midday, one of the divers surfaced, signaling to the team. They had found something wedged between two submerged boulders, a heavy tarpaulin, wrapped and bound with nylon rope. Inside were bones. The remains were later confirmed through dental records to be Sarah Miller. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, likely caused by blunt force trauma, and traces of plastic fibers matching the tarp found in the water. The medical examiner concluded that Sarah had died before entering the sea. Back in Manchester, news of the discovery reached her family. Her mother, Anne, broke down when the call came. After months of clinging to hope, she finally had the truth, but not the kind of truth anyone wants. "At least we can bring her home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. When detectives confronted Daniel with the evidence, his mask finally cracked. The photograph, the tarp, the DNA, it was all irrefutable. Still, he refused to admit guilt. "You're twisting everything," he said, his voice shaking. "We argued, yes, but I didn't kill her. She slipped. She hit her head. I panicked." Detective Duarte didn't believe a word of it. "You panicked," he repeated coldly, "so you wrapped her in plastic, weighted her down, and threw her into the ocean?" Daniel stared at the floor, saying nothing. The investigation team reconstructed his movements from that night. Witnesses recalled seeing his car driving toward the cliffs around midnight, the trunk covered by a blue tarp. CCTV footage from a petrol station showed him buying cleaning supplies and fuel the following morning. When police examined his phone, they found recent searches that made their stomachs turn: how to clean blood from grout, can saltwater erase DNA, and how deep do bodies sink. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel Walsh was charged with murder, concealment of a body, and obstruction of justice. The trial would later reveal that the final days of Sarah's life had been ones of fear and tension. Friends back home described her as frightened but determined. She had confided to Laura that she planned to leave Daniel and fly home within the week. "I can't do this anymore," she had written in her final unsent email, found saved in her laptop drafts. "He's not who I thought he was. I'm scared of him now." That email would become one of the prosecution's most powerful pieces of evidence. As the case gained international attention, reporters descended on both England and Portugal. The image of Daniel, once seen as a charming boyfriend starting a new life abroad, was replaced by the chilling portrait of a manipulative man who believed he could rewrite the truth. In one interview outside court, Sarah's sister Laura spoke through tears. "He didn't just kill her. He tried to erase her. Pretend she never existed. But he couldn't silence her completely. The truth came back, just like the tide. The sea had finally given up its secret." By the time Daniel Walsh stood trial, nearly 2 years had passed since Sarah Miller's disappearance. The courtroom in Lisbon was packed from the first day. Journalists, locals, and foreign correspondents filled every seat, their cameras flashing as Daniel was escorted in, wearing a dark suit and the same detached expression he had shown since his arrest. He looked thinner, older. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, had lost none of their chill. The prosecution opened with a simple, devastating statement: "This is not the story of a woman who vanished. It is the story of a woman who was silenced." Led by prosecutor Isabel Torres, the state presented its case with surgical precision. She described how Daniel had lured Sarah to Portugal with promises of a new beginning, all while hiding the truth, that he had another relationship, another child, and a history of control and violence. When Sarah discovered his lies and tried to leave, he snapped. The evidence was damning. Forensic experts detailed the traces of Sarah's blood beneath the bathroom tiles, her hair strands caught in the trunk of Daniel's car, and the fibers from the tarp that matched those found wrapped around her remains. Then came the emails, the ones Daniel had written after killing her, pretending to be Sarah. A digital forensic expert testified that the emails had been sent from Daniel's laptop, connecting directly to the cottage's Wi-Fi network. He had even gone as far as to mimic her writing style in early drafts before sending the final messages to her family. As each piece of evidence was laid out, the mask Daniel wore in public began to slip. Occasionally, he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering angrily. Other times, he stared blankly at the wall, his jaw clenched, his fingers tapping the table in restless defiance. The defense tried to paint a different picture. Daniel's lawyer argued that Sarah's death had been a tragic accident, claiming the couple had fought, she'd fallen, and Daniel had panicked. He admitted that Daniel had disposed of the body, a cowardly mistake, he called it, but insisted there was no intent to kill. But the prosecution dismantled that argument swiftly. They reminded the court of Daniel's incriminating searches online, his history of violence, and his cold attempts to manipulate the narrative afterward. The courtroom fell silent when the final witness took the stand, Sarah's sister, Laura. Her voice trembled at first, but she found strength as she spoke. She described Sarah's last months, her growing fear, her attempts to reach out for help. She read from the final email draft found on Sarah's laptop, the one she never got to send. "I thought love meant safety," Laura read, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "But I see now that love shouldn't hurt this much. I'm leaving tomorrow. I just hope he lets me." There wasn't a sound in the room. Daniel shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. When closing arguments came, Prosecutor Torres looked directly at the jury. "Daniel Walsh did not lose control for a moment," she said. "He planned, he covered, and he lied. He did not panic, he decided. And that decision ended a woman's life." After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom held its breath. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice steady. Daniel Walsh was convicted of murder, obstruction of justice, and falsification of evidence. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. As guards led him away, Daniel's expression remained eerily calm, but for a fleeting second, as he glanced toward Sarah's family, something in his eyes broke. Perhaps fear. Perhaps regret. Outside the courthouse, Laura faced the cameras, tears glistening in the sunlight. "My sister wanted peace," she said softly. "He took that from her. But today, she finally has her voice back." When the verdict was announced, a hush fell over the courtroom, a silence so complete that even the rustle of paper stopped. For a brief moment, the only sound came from Sarah's mother, and, letting out a trembling breath she'd been holding for 2 years. The fight was over. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. Outside, the air felt different. Reporters called out questions as the family stepped onto the courthouse steps, but Laura held her mother's hand tightly and walked past them, ignoring the cameras. For them, this wasn't a victory, it was the end of a nightmare. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Island murder made headlines across Europe. Newspapers ran photographs of Sarah, her radiant smile, her windswept hair, the carefree moments captured before she met Daniel Walsh. To the world, she became a symbol of trust betrayed, of love turned deadly. But to her family, she was simply the girl they'd lost, the sister who laughed too loudly, the daughter who always left notes on the fridge before she went out. Daniel, meanwhile, was transferred to a maximum security prison outside Lisbon. Reports described him as quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his days in solitary silence. Inmates said he rarely spoke, only pacing his small cell and writing letters he never sent. Some believed he was still trying to convince himself, and the world, that he wasn't guilty. Detective Miguel Duarte, who had led the investigation from the beginning, returned to the cliffs one evening months later. The sea was calm that day, the waves gentle against the rocks. He stood near the very spot where divers had recovered Sarah's remains. For a long time, he said nothing, only watching the water as the sun dipped below the horizon. Later, when asked why he'd gone back, he said quietly, because that's where the truth was waiting all along. Sarah's body was brought home to England for burial. The funeral took place on a rainy morning in Bristol, attended by family, friends, and dozens of people who had followed her story. Her coffin was simple, white with a single bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind that once grew outside her cottage in Portugal. Laura gave a short eulogy, her voice breaking halfway through. "She was brave," she said. "Braver than we knew. And though he tried to erase her, she left her mark everywhere, in our hearts, in our memories, and even in the waves that carried her back to us." Over time, the family found ways to heal. And began volunteering for a charity that helps women escape abusive relationships. Laura, determined to keep her sister's story alive, created a foundation in Sarah's name, one that funds safe housing for women abroad. Each year, on the anniversary of her sister's death, Laura visits the seaside with a single white rose and throws it into the water. As for the cottage on the island, it stood empty for a long time. Locals avoided it, saying they could still hear doors creaking at night or smell the faint scent of perfume on the wind. Eventually, the building was sold, renovated, and turned into a small guest house. But for those who knew its story, it was more than just a house, it was a monument to everything love can hide. Years later, one of the divers who found Sarah's remains said he still thought of her whenever he worked those waters. "The ocean doesn't keep secrets," he said. "It just waits for the right moment to tell them." In the end, that was the cruelest truth of all, that Daniel Walsh had chosen one of the most peaceful places on earth to hide one of the darkest acts imaginable. And yet, no matter how carefully he planned, no matter how tightly he tried to control the story, the sea, the truth, and time itself refused to let Sarah Miller be forgotten. Even in the quietest corners of paradise, darkness can take root. But no matter how deep it's buried, the truth has a way of rising, just like the tide.